They approached him, unaware of the true horror within the walls of that home. Two bodies lay cold on the floor. No signs of a struggle, no obvious clues, just two people, Shari Mallory-Maxa, 74, and Anthony Maxa, 76, lying lifeless from multiple gunshot wounds. The man in front of them, Chevy Kyler Monaghan, had no fear, no urgency. In fact, he told police he wasn't a threat. "They're in their room fighting," he claimed. But as the officers stepped inside, the truth became undeniable. It wasn't a fight. It was murder, methodical, brutal, and with a chilling sense of calm. It all started with a routine 911 call. A concerned citizen worried about their neighbors placed the call at 12:15 p.m. on a Tuesday afternoon. But little did anyone know, this call would set in motion a series of events so chilling, it would rattle the foundation of a family and a quiet community in Austin. By 2:45, police were on the scene, and as officers arrived, they witnessed something that made their stomachs tighten in disbelief. A man, nonchalant, unfazed, as if nothing out of the ordinary was happening, calmly lit a joint in front of the officers. His actions so casual, as though the world hadn't just been shattered inside the apartment behind him. Shari Mallory-Maxa and Anthony Maxa were the kind of grandparents that every child dreams of having. They lived in a modest home in a quiet neighborhood in Austin, Texas, a city known for its dynamic culture, music scene, and lively streets. But despite the vibrancy of the city around them, Shari and Anthony's world was built on a foundation of simplicity, love, and family. A world far removed from the noise and chaos that often come with living in a city known for its hustle. The couple, both in their 70s, had spent decades crafting a life together. A life centered around each other and their family. Their home was a sanctuary of sorts, a place where their children and grandchildren always felt welcome, loved, and safe. It was the kind of house where laughter could always be heard, where there was always room for one more at the dinner table, and where comfort and stability were constants in an ever-changing world. Shari, 74, was the heart and soul of the family. She had spent much of her life as a teacher, dedicating her career to helping young minds grow and learn. But even after her retirement, her passion for nurturing never waned. Outside the classroom, Shari had found another outlet for her nurturing spirit: gardening. She spent hours in her backyard, her hands buried in the earth, coaxing flowers to bloom and vegetables to thrive. To her, there was something deeply satisfying about watching things grow, and this love for nature mirrored the way she cared for her family, gently, patiently, and always with a steady hand. Those who knew Shari often described her as a beacon of kindness and wisdom. Her words carried weight, not because of her position or title, but because of the love and thoughtfulness that infused everything she said. She was always there to lend a listening ear, to offer guidance when asked, and to make anyone who crossed her path feel like they were the most important person in the room. Whether it was a family member, a neighbor, or a friend, Shari had a way of making people feel seen and heard. She had a heart as big as her garden, and she shared it freely with everyone around her. Anthony, 76, was her steadfast companion, her rock. A former mechanic, he had spent much of his working life fixing cars, engines, and machines. But his true passion lay in the art of woodworking. When the tools were put down at the end of the day, Anthony could be found in his workshop, hands covered in sawdust, meticulously shaping pieces of wood into furniture. A coffee table here, a rocking chair there. Each project was a labor of love. The precision and skill that Anthony poured into every piece was a reflection of his character. Hardworking, patient, and dedicated to the things that mattered most. Though he didn't often speak much about his emotions, Anthony's love for his family was clear in every action he took. He had a quiet strength, a strength that was evident when he spent hours in his garage teaching his grandchildren how to use tools, how to fix things, and most importantly, how to appreciate the value of hard work. He wasn't just a grandfather, he was a mentor, a teacher, and someone who showed his family the importance of persistence and dedication. For Anthony, life was about more than just the work. It was about the people you loved and the legacy you left behind. Together, Shari and Anthony formed the backbone of their family. They were a team in every sense of the word. It wasn't just that they worked well together, it was that their bond was unshakable. Over the years, they built a life filled with memories, family gatherings, holidays, birthdays, and lazy afternoons spent in each other's company. They had been married for over 50 years, having met when they were both in their late teens. In a world where many relationships break down over time, Shari and Anthony's love only grew stronger. They had weathered many challenges together, but there was no doubt in anyone's mind that their love for one another, and for their family, was the glue that held everything together. The Maxas were the epitome of what many would call family-oriented. They made sure their grandchildren knew they were loved unconditionally. Whether it was picking them up from school, attending their extracurricular events, or simply spending time together, Shari and Anthony always made their family a priority. There was a sense of security in their presence. Their home was the kind of place where you could always count on warmth and acceptance no matter what. Shari, with her infectious laugh and caring touch, had a way of bringing people together. She would host regular family dinners where the table would be filled with homemade food, stories, and laughter. Every meal was more than just about eating. It was about connection, about sharing experiences, and about showing up for each other. And Anthony, though quiet, would often be in the kitchen, helping out or making sure everyone had what they needed, content in his role as the solid, unassuming presence that held everything in place. They were the grandparents who made you feel special, who gave you their time, attention, and love without hesitation. They weren't just there for the big moments like birthdays and holidays, they were there for the quiet, everyday moments that meant just as much. A phone call just to check in, a warm hug after a hard day, a piece of advice shared over a cup of coffee. These were the things that Shari and Anthony gave to their family without expecting anything in return. Their love was their gift, and it was one they gave freely, with open arms and open hearts. But on that fateful Tuesday afternoon, everything would change. A phone call would soon send shockwaves through their family, forever altering the lives of those who had known Shari and Anthony as the cornerstones of their world. Chevy Kyler Monaghan, the 25-year-old grandson of Shari Mallory-Maxa and Anthony Maxa, had been acting in ways that raised concern for weeks leading up to the day of the murder. Those close to him described a young man whose demeanor had shifted. Chevy, once a familiar face at family gatherings, had become increasingly distant. Family members noticed him withdrawing more and more, barely speaking to his grandparents, and often locking himself away in his room. He was angry, easily frustrated, and quick to lash out. His behavior was erratic. No one could pinpoint exactly what was driving him, but it was clear that something was wrong. In addition to his personal issues, Chevy had a history of run-ins with the law. He had been arrested before for minor offenses, but rumors began to swirl around him. Rumors about his involvement with drugs. Some said that he had started hanging around with the wrong crowd, getting into situations that made even his closest relatives uneasy. The once close-knit family dynamic was beginning to crack. But despite these warning signs, no one could have foreseen what would happen next. As his relationship with Shari and Anthony grew strained, there was an underlying tension, an unspoken discomfort that permeated every interaction. It wasn't the kind of thing that was immediately noticeable to outsiders, but to those who knew the family well, it was clear that the warmth once shared between Chevy and his grandparents had been replaced by an unmistakable chill. Conversations that were once easy and lighthearted had turned awkward, and the loving, supportive bond that had defined their relationship seemed to have slowly dissipated. Chevy Kyler Monaghan later explained, with a fight. "They got into a big fight," he said, his words flat and emotionless. "They're in their rooms stewing mad at each other. You don't want to see it." But the calmness in his voice was in stark contrast to the storm of violence that was unfolding just beyond those words. Inside the bedroom, Shari and Anthony had no idea that their lives were about to be violently ripped apart. The couple, who had always been the anchors of their family, were simply trying to make sense of the argument. They had no time to reconcile, no time to understand why their own flesh and blood had turned against them. The realization must have come too late, the cold steel of a gun pressed against them, their last moments spent struggling for breath, the shock of betrayal lingering in the air. Chevy, standing over them, wasn't just a grandson in that moment. He was an executioner, methodical and detached. He had brought the gun, a .380 caliber handgun, from his bedroom, bought just days before at a local pawn shop, and now it was in his hands. It was personal. The weapon, cold and unforgiving, reflected the violence in his heart. And when he pulled the trigger, it wasn't just an attack on his grandparents, it was the final severing of a bond that had once been full of love. Shari, 74, was shot 3 times, the first 2 shots likely coming swiftly, the sound of the gunfire echoing through the quiet of the house. With each pull of the trigger, the weight of the decision settled deeper in Chevy's mind, a decision that he knew would change everything forever. The trajectory of the shots indicated a chilling precision, each one deliberate, each one aimed to ensure the outcome. The horror didn't stop there. Anthony, 76, was shot 6 times. The violence inflicted upon him was relentless. His face was a testament to the closeness of the attack. The gunshot wound to his face indicated that the muzzle had been less than 3 feet away, the warmth of the barrel probably still lingering on his skin as the bullet tore through him. Each shot, fired from a position that suggested he was helpless, lying on the floor, vulnerable and unable to defend himself. The sheer force of the attack left him gasping for air, each breath becoming more desperate as the life slowly drained from him. The gunshots were so close, so intimate, that it seemed the killer had stood directly over them, watching as their lives slipped away. The horror in their final moments must have been unimaginable, each one knowing the person who had pulled the trigger was someone they had loved, someone they had raised. There was no struggle, no sign that either Shari or Anthony had tried to flee. In the quiet of their final moments, they were caught in the horror of betrayal. Their bodies lay together, side by side, lifeless, only the emptiness of the space between them left behind. Outside, Chevy was still calm, almost indifferent to what he had just done. As he sat on the porch, smoking his joint and sipping his soda, it was as if nothing had happened. He felt no urgency, no fear. The quiet that surrounded him mirrored the coldness in his actions. The space, once a sanctuary for the couple, had been ransacked with terrifying precision. Drawers were torn open, flung to the floor with a savage disregard for the lives that had once inhabited them. Empty jewelry boxes, keepsakes, symbols of love and cherished memories, now lay discarded in the chaos. The glint of missing rings, necklaces, and bracelets lingered in the stillness. There were no signs of a struggle. No indication that Shari or Anthony had tried to fight back or flee. The violence that had unfolded in those final moments was swift, deliberate, and crushing. Yet, despite the brutality of their deaths, it was as if they had never stood a chance. The scene bore the unmistakable stamp of calculated intent. Someone had carefully planned, executed, and then calmly walked around for a cigarette. He wasn't pacing or anxious. He wasn't even pretending to be upset or concerned. The contrast between the calm he projected and the carnage inside was suffocating. There was a sense that, in his mind, he had already gotten away with something. Something so dark, so profound, that it had erased any remnants of empathy, of connection. It was as if the very act of committing the murder had satisfied him in some way. His nonchalant attitude was chilling. He wasn't pacing or anxious. He wasn't even pretending to be upset or concerned. The contrast between the calm he projected and the carnage inside was suffocating. There was a sense that, in his mind, he had already gotten away with something. Something so dark, so profound, that it had erased any remnants of empathy, of connection. It was as if the very act of committing the murder had satisfied him in some way, and now he was simply waiting for the inevitable moment when others would realize what he had done. The emptiness in the room matched the emptiness in Chevy's eyes. He had taken everything he needed, not just their lives but also their trust, their love, and the security they had worked their entire lives to build. He had plundered their most prized possessions, just as he had plundered their lives, with a detached sense of purpose. Inside Chevy's pockets, the disturbing truths began to reveal themselves. Pistol ammunition, a small bag of prescription medication, promethazine, belonging to Shari, and a long string of pearls, irreplaceable heirlooms that had once graced his grandmother's neck, now tucked away in his back pocket. It was as if he had been so calm, so certain of his actions, that he thought nothing of walking around with the evidence of his brutality still on him. His lack of urgency spoke volumes. To him there was no consequence, just a job well done. But the horror didn't end with the discovery of the stolen pearls. Further investigation uncovered even more pieces of the dark puzzle. In his bedroom, officers found the .380 caliber handgun, the very weapon that had ended Shari and Anthony's lives. Bought just days before the murders from a pawn shop. The realization struck with the weight of 1,000 silent screams. This wasn't some spur-of-the-moment crime, a heat-of-the-moment act of passion. This was cold, planned, and executed with chilling precision. And as if the stolen jewelry and weapon weren't enough, Chevy's car held even more damning evidence. Dozens of boxes filled with women's jewelry, pieces that officers would later identify as belonging to Shari and Anthony. It was as though the house had been emptied not just of its lives but of its history, its memories. The personal effects of a lifetime now sitting in Chevy's car, as if he were a common thief, collecting his spoils. Bags filled with jewelry, blank checks from Shari and Anthony's personal accounts, and additional rounds of small-caliber ammunition. It was clear now that Chevy had been methodically gathering his bounty, as if each item was a symbol of his conquest, each piece of stolen jewelry a reminder of the life he had taken. It didn't take long for detectives to realize that this wasn't an ordinary domestic dispute gone wrong. The details, the physical evidence, and the eerie calmness of Chevy Kyler Monaghan, their prime suspect, suggested something far more deliberate. The facts pointed toward premeditation, an intent to kill that had been carefully planned, executed, and hidden behind a facade of indifference. And all the while, Chevy sat just outside the crime scene as calm as could be, smoking a joint and sipping soda, seemingly detached from the reality of the terror he had just inflicted on his grandparents. The forensic evidence would be the first step in exposing the truth. As the body of Anthony Maxa was carefully examined, the medical examiner made a disturbing discovery. The wounds on his face, particularly the gunshot wound, indicated that the gun had been fired from less than 3 feet away. This was no random shot fired in haste. This was a deliberate act of violence, meant to ensure that the victim could not survive. And the trajectory of the bullets? It told the story of an execution. The shooter hadn't simply fired at his victims from a distance. He had stood over them, point blank, and unloaded the weapon at close range. Shari Mallory-Maxa's body, too, told a similar story. She had been shot 3 times, each shot a calculated, focused strike. The fact that these were close-range gunshot wounds added another layer to the horror, the cold precision of a killer who was determined to end their lives without hesitation. There was no panic in the execution, no attempt to flee. It was as if Chevy had made up his mind long before that fateful day that his grandparents had to die. The investigators now understood. This wasn't a crime of opportunity. This was a well-thought-out plan that had unfolded with the same chilling calmness with which Chevy had greeted the officers at the scene. The police moved to gather evidence from Chevy's home. In his bedroom, a .380 caliber handgun was found. Just days before, it had been purchased from a pawn shop. For investigators, the timing was impossible to ignore. The gun had been bought only a short time before the murders, further cementing the idea that this was not an impulsive act. This was planned. And the fact that Chevy had been in possession of the weapon left little doubt as to his involvement in the crime. But there was more. The weapon, though, wasn't the only clue. In his pockets, police found additional ammunition, matching the caliber of the bullets used to kill Shari and Anthony, along with an unexpected item, a string of pearls. The pearls, once worn by his grandmother, were a personal possession. They had no logical reason to be in his pockets. And the fact that he had them suggested something far more sinister. This wasn't just a crime of violence, it was a crime of greed. Chevy had stolen from his victims, his own grandparents, ransacking their bedroom and taking anything of value. And yet, even with this new evidence, the most chilling detail remained his behavior. Despite the growing mountain of proof against him, Chevy remained eerily calm throughout the investigation. In the hours following his arrest, when detectives finally brought him in for questioning, he stuck to his story. They got into a big fight, he told them, his voice eerily flat, as though he were describing a trivial argument rather than a double homicide. They're in their room stewing mad at each other, you don't want to see it. Chevy's response, detached and emotionless, didn't make sense to the detectives. No one who had just been involved in the brutal murder of 2 people would speak with such cold indifference. The interviews and interrogations with Chevy began to reveal even more contradictions in his story. Each time he spoke, it became clearer that he was hiding something. When pressed further, he claimed that he had tried to protect his grandparents during the fight. Yet the evidence showed otherwise. His actions were not those of someone trying to intervene, but of someone who had been preparing for something far more violent. The ammunition found on him, the gun purchased days before the murders, none of it fit the story he was telling. And there was more, something that struck even deeper at the heart of the investigation. The room that had been ransacked, the drawers thrown to the floor, the missing jewelry, and the stolen items. All of it pointed to a man who had been searching for something specific. What had Chevy been after? Why had he taken those things, especially the jewelry that was so personal to Shari? Had he planned on selling them, or was the theft an attempt to cover his tracks, to erase any trace of what had really happened? Detectives began to speculate. If Chevy had simply stolen money or items of value, it might have been a simple robbery gone wrong. But the combination of the cold execution-style killings, the stolen items, and his calm, methodical approach suggested something much darker, something that had nothing to do with mere theft. This wasn't about money. This was personal. The arrest of Chevy Kyler Monaghan was swift. Less than a day after the murders of his grandparents, he was taken into custody. The evidence was mounting, and there was no room for doubt. Despite his nonchalant demeanor, his lack of emotional response, and his disarming calmness, it was clear to law enforcement that this was no simple case of a family dispute gone wrong. No, the brutality of the murders and the calculated manner in which they had been carried out suggested something far darker, and much more deliberate. Chevy was charged with 2 counts of capital murder. The decision to charge him with capital murder was based on the cold nature of the crime, the premeditation, and the violence he had inflicted on Shari and Anthony. But even as the charges were read aloud, there was still a sense of disbelief hanging over the case. A grandson, someone who had grown up in this home, who had been raised with the love and care of his grandparents, had been the one to take their lives. How could it be? What had driven him to do such a thing? As the days passed, Chevy's trial began to take shape. The courtroom quickly became a spectacle. The media swarmed, eager to capture every moment of this shocking case. It was a story that captivated the public, an unsettling mix of family betrayal, violence, and the chilling indifference of a grandson who appeared untouched by the brutality of his actions. The defense team's strategy was clear from the start. They painted Chevy as a troubled young man, someone who had snapped under the weight of life's pressures. His past run-ins with the law, his history of erratic behavior, and his strained relationship with his grandparents were all brought to the forefront. The defense tried to frame the murders as a moment of madness, a tragic event where the pressure of family conflicts, drugs, and mental health issues had culminated in an unthinkable act of violence. But the prosecution's case was far more compelling. The evidence against Chevy was overwhelming, and every new revelation only made the case stronger. The prosecution revealed the cold, calculated nature of the murders, the chilling details of the crime scene, and most damning of all, the stolen jewelry and blank checks found in Chevy's possession. These items, once the cherished belongings of Shari and Anthony, had been taken by their own grandson, suggesting that the murders had been motivated not just by anger but by greed. The courtroom was filled with tension as the prosecution laid out its case. With each new piece of evidence, each stolen item, each piece of forensic analysis, and every new detail about the gun used to commit the murders, the full scope of Chevy's crime became clearer. The most shocking moment came when the prosecution revealed the stash of jewelry and the checks. The once warm, loving home of Shari and Anthony Maxa had been plundered, not just of lives, but of everything that had held value to them: memories, possessions, and their trust. The trial's closing arguments were a turning point. The defense urged the jury to consider the complexity of Chevy's mental state, his troubled history, and his youth. But it was the prosecution's final words that lingered in the air. They reminded the jury that Shari and Anthony had been victims of a cold-blooded betrayal, not a random act of violence. The prosecution argued that Chevy had carefully planned the murders, executed them with precision, and then moved to cover his tracks by stealing from the very people who had loved and cared for him. The jury deliberated for hours, the weight of the evidence bearing down on them. Finally, they returned with their verdict: guilty of 2 counts of capital murder. The room was silent as the judge read the verdict aloud. The Maxa family, who had sat through every moment of the trial, now sat with tears in their eyes, tears of sorrow, anger, and relief. Chevy Kyler Monaghan was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. In the wake of the trial, the aftermath was felt deeply by everyone involved. Chevy Monaghan, now behind bars, would spend the rest of his life in prison, his fate sealed by the jury's decision. But the Maxa family was left to pick up the pieces of their shattered lives. Shari and Anthony were irreplaceable, 2 figures who had meant everything to their children and grandchildren. Their loss left a void that could never be filled. The Maxas were more than just grandparents. They were the pillars of the family, the people who had held everything together with love, kindness, and unwavering support. Their absence was like a wound that would never heal, a reminder of the betrayal that tore through their family. The grandchildren who had once felt safe in their arms now had to cope with the reality that their own flesh and blood had been responsible for their deaths. The family spoke out publicly, remembering the love and care Shari and Anthony had given to them. They spoke of the joy that the couple had brought into their lives, and the loss that would haunt them forever. Tony and Shari are absolutely irreplaceable in so many ways to so many, but especially to their grandchildren, they said. They lived for their grandchildren and made sure that each one of them felt like the most important person in the world. As the family grieved, the public reaction to the case was just as intense. The media covered the trial from start to finish, and discussions of family dynamics, mental health, and the role of drugs and violence became central themes in the aftermath. There were debates about whether Chevy had been driven to this crime by a history of mental health issues, substance abuse, or something more sinister within his psyche. The months passed, theories continued to emerge. Some speculated that the murders were a result of Chevy's escalating financial desperation, while others wondered if there was a deeper, more psychological explanation. Was the violence purely motivated by greed, or had something in Chevy's mind broken long before the crime? The idea that this might have been a premeditated act, driven by emotions he had carefully buried, began to take root in the public consciousness. Though the case had concluded, the questions remained. Had Chevy truly snapped, or was this a carefully crafted plan? What was the real reason behind his betrayal? Was it simply for money, or was there something much darker that he kept hidden from everyone, including himself? What was clear to everyone, though, was the lasting impact of this tragedy on the Maxa family. The pain, the heartbreak, the unanswered questions, it was all a heavy burden to bear. And as for Chevy, behind the cold walls of his prison cell, the weight of his actions would be his to carry for the rest of his life. The family, forever scarred, would never be the same. Shari and Anthony Maxa were not just victims of a crime. They were pillars of their family, givers of love and guidance. Their loss is immeasurable, not just for their children but for the grandchildren who adored them. Their once peaceful home has now become a painful memory, forever marked by the violence that was brought into it by the person who should have been closest to them, Chevy Kyler Monaghan. Thank you for following this story through every twist and turn. If you want to stay updated on more true crime cases, make sure to like, share, and subscribe. Turn on notifications so you never miss an update on the latest chilling investigations we'll be covering. We know this case has left you with many questions, and we'll continue to follow up on any new developments that might emerge.